I'm not used to speaking with a mic because my voice projects, so I throw that disclaimer out very quickly that I'm not a brutal person because my voice portrays it, so at least I try not to be. Let me just kind of give you some info on the Veritas Exchange itself. We are a Christian apologetic local organization to local college and universities, but also we train high school students. And we do train up young people who are either going into ministry or they are going to some type of heavy secular academic organization or some type of institution. So we have many roles, and but we're also here to support the local churches, and we want to be a blessing to them. And I'm excited because I see a lot of my supporters. I see a lot of faces I've never met. The Veritas Exchange is just, we just go around and we usually do it in forum-based. I have debated before. I'm the only one that has debated. The scientists that work with me, they get the easy questions and then they give me this one. So we're going to do our best, and I'm going to do my best to you have an outline so you can follow along, and hopefully we will be able to have a good discussion tonight. The talk hopefully is going to last about 45 minutes, and I really encourage your questions, and I'm just very excited to get into this stuff. This is the first time I've done this topic, so let me throw a few disclaimers out here before I get started, because this topic is really sensitive, and I'm not here to say that I'm just going to give you the greatest case and all your problems are just going to magically go away. I'm here to hopefully give you some principles and some things that can, encourage you and make you think deeper about God and who He is. The second thing is there are many nuances and facets to this issue. And we can look at them straight from a philosophical sense. We can look at them and philosophical, what I mean is like kind of build arguments and see if they make any sense. And then we can deal with it in the existential world, which just means in human life, how do we struggle with these things? One way in the existential world that we all communicate this problem, not with words per se, is through arts, through books, through music. But the angle I'm going to take tonight, the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to just kind of give you a brief overview of what I'm going to do. I'm going to capture this in a story, and a true story. And then what I want to do is then envelop the talk within that, and then I'll give you the conclusion of the story at the end. But I'm going to go through, and the first thing is I'm going to give you a little bit of background on this gentleman. This gentleman lived in the ADs when our years in the AD only had 3 numbers. So it was before 1000 AD. He was quite an Englishman, and he affected the world. He literally changed pretty much the continent that he was born in. He would pretty much come and change it because this man was inspired by Christ to face evil. And that's my challenge to you today. I am not here to give you information to say, oh, this is good, or I'm here to make you think. I want you to think. Christians, I want you to be encouraged. For the people who don't believe, who are skeptical here, I want you to open your minds up. I hope that this information will be beneficial to you, but to open your heart, that's the work of God. And I realize that. And I know that I'm not going to argue anyone into the kingdom. But at the same time, I know that as an apologist, as a philosopher, as a person who loves God, I've always been challenged by God. Some of these issues are very personal to me. And so there was a lot of struggle with what to leave out in this presentation because I had so much. But here's the angle we're going to go at. We're going to deal, first of all, in 4 spheres. The first sphere is going to be the philosophical sphere. We are going to see whether or not it's rational from an agnostic or atheistic point of view to call anything evil. The second sphere is the next 2 spheres we're going to really look at are the ones I'm going to spend the most time on. Is we're going to look at the character of God as a lot of atheistic literature has come out and criticized the God of the Bible about. We will deal with Joshua and the Canaanites, we will deal with divine punishment in hell, and we will deal with slavery. And we will, it's a brief overview. I don't have that much time, and that's really why I want to throw these disclaimers out. And another disclaimer, that we are all different here. We're all made differently. And I don't want to impede. There are people who bring different backgrounds and different life experiences and different struggles. And I want you to know tonight that I am not here to criticize you. I am here to just give you another point of view. But I do stand on the truth. I will not compromise that. But at the same time, I'm not here just to poke and try to argue with people. I don't do that. I definitely care about where you're at. And if I didn't think Jesus was the answer, I wouldn't be here. So I really want you to know that. I'm not here to, but I'm here to encourage you, to make you think, and Christians to go deeper in your study of the Word of God. Look at the Old Testament again. And look at the New Testament. Look at those difficult passages, because it may be those passages that lead you to a deeper relationship with the Father. So that the existential sphere will deal with those and my responses to them. And kind of the way I'm going to do that is I'm going to deal with Joshua and the Canaanites and hell in the same response, because it's really just a question of God's justice. The questions kind of come at the angle, is God tyrannical? And then what we're going to see is the next sphere is called the redemptive sphere. And that sphere is going to be how Jesus deals with this, how He expresses this, because we see in life that answers sometimes to our greatest difficulties are sealed, that they're just not here. They don't, God just doesn't give them to us, and we're stuck, and we struggle, and it's painful. And as a Christian, I don't care whether or not you know God, I care about your struggle. I really do. And whether you convert or not too, which I'm obviously here, I'm an evangelist too, so I'm not going to hide my colors either. I love God, and I think that He is the answer to everything, but there's a lot of hard truths that even all of us as Christians who have been around long enough will admit they're hard to accept sometimes. And you see that in the Scriptures as well. You see a lot of the prophets and a lot of the disciples ask Jesus and ask the Father some very pointed questions. And God allowing this, and actually the ironic thing is God inspires this. So keep that in mind, is that I think some of our issues that we think that no one else could go through, I don't want you to feel isolated. I think that what you're going to see is someone in Scripture is already beating you to the punch. So I really want you, and then I'm just going to give you some points of remembrance, and then I will reveal the character who decided to face evil, and literally he set a legacy in this particular area where some of the most beautiful manuscripts in the New Testament have been preserved. We have them in our museums, and I'm telling you, and this is one of the most misinterpreted figures as well, and I'll give you kind of a hint. He comes right after the Roman Empire with Constantine, and he's right in the middle of the 400s, and so I want you to think about that as you go. I want you to think about these questions, and I want you to think about your life, and that God cares about you. But the first step in that is the fact that we need to, if this is God's world, we got to follow His plan. And so let's get started. I want to get started, first of all, with the philosophical sphere. And how do you define evil? What's your definition of evil? And this is not necessarily a pointed attack at atheism. It's something for the atheism to ponder. Anytime that any human being, any of us are limited in knowledge, many times there is a Pandora's box of mystery that opens up. There's a lot of controversy. There's a lot of questions that get unanswered. And a lot of times what we do is when we're in severe pain, we think getting rid of God is the answer to that question. And tonight I'm going to make the case that that's the last thing that you want to do. Number one, because as much as we see the accusation of God being a psychological crutch, and I'm not going to spend too much time here. You guys know who Sigmund Freud is. We know some of the people like Carl Jung who said that God is just a psychological crutch. But in the same thing can be said about atheism. When you want to live a lifestyle that is completely your own and antithetical to any authority, I want to do what I want. the first thing that that human being is going to have to do is dismiss God from the picture so that they don't deal with the judgment of God and they don't deal with their own conscience. They have to learn how to, they almost have to be programmed out of it. But I want to give a simple definition of evil. And what I'm going to argue is if you remove God, you're going to remove all of morality. And morality is just the standard of right and wrong. And in the Christian worldview, morality is absolute. Because here's the issue, and here's the definition I'm going to give you. Evil is a deviation or a moving away from purpose. That's the first thing. And I can define that because here's the thing. God is the ultimate definition of definition. That'll give you a headache, okay? God is the ultimate reality by which everything else gets its meaning and purpose. That's a little bit more clear. And he makes what these things are. If he didn't declare something to be, it would not be. So the thing is evil is a deviation away from purpose. But let's remove God from the equation. And Ravi Zacharias has a classical argument with the existence of God. A student at the University of Nottingham in England asked Ravi a question. He says, I don't believe, more it was a pointed statement, I don't believe in God because of the problem of evil. And Ravi said, young man, if you would remain standing, I would like to dialogue with you. And he said, if you believe in evil, you have to believe in something that's good. Is that correct? And we agree on that. And the young man had to say yes. If you believe in good and evil, you have to believe in a moral law that differentiates between good and evil, that can distinguish what is good and what is bad. And the young man knew he was, at that point, was about to get set up, and he said, okay, I'll give you that. If you have a moral law, you have to have a moral law giver. But that's who you're trying to disprove and not prove. So therefore, if you get rid of the moral law giver, there is no moral law. If there's no moral law, there's no good. If there's no good, there's no evil. What the question self-destructs. As you can see, that's very philosophical, and trust me, I'm not going to spend much time here. But think about it. They're trying to negate the very basis by which morality is based upon. God is the standard by which everything is right and wrong, beautiful and ugly, true or false. And so what you want to do is you want to think about that. Is that if you get rid of God, well then what happens to the problem of evil? I can tell you, if you dismiss God, you dismiss the absolute standard to judge right and wrong. But here's the other thing. You dismiss justice. Because now evil has been reduced to personal preference. And you see that can't happen. I like ice cream. You like ice cream. You like kicking 2-year-olds in the shins? I like kicking 2-year-olds in the shins. Is that just on the same basis as ice cream? But you remove God from the picture, that's what evil is reduced to. Evil is reduced to now a personal preference, personal taste. So, and some of the antagonists of the existence of God due to the problem of evil, you probably heard some of what I would say the older atheists. You have people like David Hume. How many people are in philosophy class, by the way? Anyway, we got some philosophers in here? All right. Yeah. You won't make any money at it, but it's fun to talk about. And we have David Hume, we have Bertrand Russell, and we have Friedrich Nietzsche. These are the men. Now, let's not criticize too many of these men, because some of these men were very honest. They were asking the hard questions that I believe the church should be asking and should have been asking for years. Is, okay, Jesus promises me this abundant life, but how can suffering and pain and evil be a part of this? And how can God overcome that? And each one of that is different. Now we have some of the newer atheists. We have the late Christopher Hitchens, we have Richard Dawkins, and we have Sam Harris. And the sad part about these guys is they're all on the New York Times bestseller list. You go look at any bestseller list, these three atheists dominate. 2 books. I mean, The God Delusion is, I believe, now sold over 3 million copies. And Christians are just beginning to scratch the surface to challenge these men. One of the things that Christians are called to do in 1 Peter 3:15 is to stand against, to give a reason for the hope that's within us. You saw Paul when he got on Mars Hill, that he disputed and debated the philosophers like the Epicureans and the Stoics. So the first thing is evil is a deviation away from purpose. You get rid of God, you get rid of the basis to call anything right or wrong, good or evil. You have some of the names. But the problem is, and this is the real problem that becomes the biggest issue, is the fact that absolute justice can't be executed. Because if I go and I, for some reason, commit some heinous crime and hurt some family, let's say I get drunk and I paralyze one of their kids in a car accident, but if that's my truth, if that's okay with me, and there really is no such thing as an absolute standard of right or wrong, it doesn't matter what I do. And this is the Pandora's box that the atheist opens up, and sometimes they don't realize it. And I want you guys to think about that. I want you to think, is it rational to dismiss God like that? But you dismiss God and you dismiss justice. Here's the last thing. Here are the two last points, and I'm going to move on. The next thing is where are you going to get your point of reference from if God is not the standard to judge right and wrong? I'm going to tell you where you're going to try to get it. You're going to try to get it from science, and you can't. And the question becomes, the ultimate question about right or wrong is, who said so? Don't walk on the grass. Who says so? Clean up your room. Who says so? And if it's not beneficial for me, then I won't do it. But here's the thing. Science can answer the how. They cannot answer the why. Science can answer the how. They cannot answer the why. If you put poison in someone's drink, science will tell you that that could severely affect the health of the one who takes it. It will not tell you why you put it in there in the first place. The next one is moral relativism, and I kind of just brushed on. Moral relativism means that morality or right or wrong is personal. It's up to the individual to make up their own set of right and wrong. And we know what that would lead to. That's called anarchy, or it can lead to communism. Might makes right. Cultural relativism. We kind of got this floating morality, and if we feel like this is like, for example, I've heard this said in some forums, like, slavery was okay and before the abolitionists, but when the abolitionists came along, the feeling or the zeitgeist kind of changed. Zeitgeist is just a slogan for the age. That kind of changed, and then all of a sudden, no, that's not good anymore. They say the same thing with abortion, and they say the same thing with other issues. They just have, it just kind of goes with the culture. It depends on the culture. It depends on just what's going on. You also have nihilism, and this is what Nietzsche embraced. And he just pretty much said everything is nothing, and you just need a lot of courage. That's nice. That's great. I mean, and let me tell you, if you don't think nihilism is great, you know about the God of Dead movement. God is Dead movement. We know about the trench coat movement, and we know who Kurt Cobain is. He was a nihilist. And he killed himself. He wasn't a hypocrite. And then there's biological determinism, which basically means that my genes made me do it. Well, then why is anyone in jail? Because if you're forced to believe something because you're genetically predisposed to do it, well, then you shouldn't be held accountable. There is no such thing as right or wrong. It's just you need medication. So that's what we're left with. Not only can you not define evil, evil becomes a matter of personal preference, and the point of reference is going to be in one of these categories. And here's the final point. The final point is how can people like us, include especially me, who have contributed to the problem of evil, complain about the very problem to a perfect God? Aren't we hypocrites? When we say, well, I don't believe in God because of the problem of evil, well, unless I'm perfect, I'm not justified in asking the question in the first place. Let's move on to the existential sphere. Let's look at some of the problems that the Scripture kind of brings up.
And the first one, we have several, and I'm not going to spend too much time on this because I can't. But I want for you to think about Joshua and the Canaanites, that God is this great ethnic cleanser. That he hates these people and he has these arbitrary emotions, he's whimsical, and he's just going to, today I feel like just wiping out the Canaanites. I mean, everything is right, you know, the Trinity is making me feel this way. I think today is the day. Joshua, go kill them. And you have people like Richard Dawkins, especially in the God Delusion, who writes about this. But we've all struggled with this, and it makes us not do our devotions in the book of Joshua anymore, because it's tough. I guarantee you should never do your devotions in the book of Judges, to wake up in the morning and find out some of the things that happened in that era is kind of freaky, but do your devotions in all the Bible. So this is a point, right? Anyway, so the accusation is that God is, and I'm going to present all the issues and then I'm going to respond to them. The next issue is hell. That God is a tyrant and he overcompensates punishment for the crime. Why do I have to deal with God? And it seems like he is bringing more to me in terms of the punishment just because I won't believe in him. Well, there's a lot more to that. And we'll get into that in a second. And so, and I will tell you the dilemma with removing hell. There's a huge dilemma with that. And if you're on the wrong side of that coin, but these are struggles, and let me tell you, as a Christian, I struggle with these, okay? I picked three that these ones jar me at times. When I read them, I can go and kind of figure things out a little bit, but at the same time, these are human beings, they're not objects. So we have this thing, and even when you can take and make a logical case that without God, evil just becomes a matter of personal preference, it still doesn't take away that struggle, does it? It doesn't take away. And now the attack is against the character of God. So we're going to look at that, and we're going to look at the mystery. And the last one is slavery, and there's a huge problem with this. But you really have to think, you have to kind of get your mind around it. If Hebrew slavery was like American slavery, there would be no black Christians. And there's a difference. You see a tremendous difference between Egyptian bondage, which God got the Israelites out of, and Hebrew slavery. And let me give you the right word: indentured servantship. Because slavery was voluntary. That the slaves had to put themselves on the market. They were not captured. So why would God deliver the Israelites out of Egyptian bondage, saying that's not the right thing to do, and then go ahead and let his people do the very same thing? That'd be kind of hypocritical, wouldn't it? So we got to think here. Well, let me give you my response to the first two, and then I will move on to the redemptive sphere and how Jesus combats evil. So the first part that we have is the philosophical case, that without God, evil just becomes kind of a matter of flavors of ice cream, and that we are hypocritical in complaining about the problem itself. And that becomes a struggle. We have no point of reference to define anything, and we struggle for that point of reference. We struggle without God. You really cannot define what evil is. As a Christian, I know what evil is. God had a purpose and a direction for every single one of us in here. He has a special plan. And he has a passion, and he designed this world for your freedom and for your good. We're the ones that rebel, so evil is a deviation from God's purpose. It's a simple definition. And when we go away from that, that's where we get the terms immoral. But where is the atheist going to get their point of reference when everything is a big accident? The nature just kind of burped morality into existence. We have to think about that. If life is a cosmic accident, where does morality come from? And I can promise you this, and I say this with all sensitivity. I'm not here to embarrass an atheist. I'm not here I have some very good atheistic friends. And they are some of the most honest people that I know. I disagree with them, and they disagree with me. It makes for good lunch get-togethers. It really does. But it's a struggle for both of us. Both the Christian but the atheist are asking the right questions. That I hope tonight that as you go through your scriptures again, that you will start asking these questions, that they will get in the church, and that Christians who love you, Christians who want to get up alongside you like these campus organizations, and they will get alongside you and go through these difficulties with you. Because that's what Jesus did. And when we get to the name Emmanuel, you're going to see God is nearer than you think He is. So let me deal with the issue of kind of the divine punishment issue, as well as kind of the Joshua and the Canaanites issue, because they go together, because it's just punishment. Well, the first thing I want to reveal to you is, and this is the first part of the response, is God's justice is not man's vengeance. That's the first thing I want you to know. That man's anger, I don't care how much he pounds a pulpit. I really don't. It doesn't help God's justice one bit. God never asked for any help. I think we should be pounding the pulpit more about grace. And people say, well, okay, where do you get that from? James 2:13 said, mercy triumphed over justice. So God is looking to be merciful, and He settles for justice. It's like a good cop. A good cop would never want to actually execute his or her profession, because that means there's no crime. God would not want to be a judge, because that means people are getting saved and redeemed. That's the God that we know. So that's the first thing, that God's justice is not man's vengeance. Now there's a specific method by which God deals with wickedness, and it starts in Genesis 15:16, where Abraham is not allowed to go into the promised land because the cup of the Amorites' iniquity is not full. And that's a very key phrase, because there were still some people to the point where God said this nation is not up for judgment. And it's amazing that He would say that to the father of the Israelite faith. That He says, you're not going to enter in this land. It's going to be about 4 generations before you guys go into this promised land that I promised you, because these people are not wicked enough yet. And so that cup of iniquity is the basis by which God judges every nation and every individual. There will be a time when God says, if we do not respond to Him, enough is enough. And I have to deal with the sin that is there. Now, are there any examples? Absolutely. We see this in Sodom and Gomorrah. And you see the extent by which God is willing to spare a nation. He says to Abraham, 10 righteous people, and I will spare this nation completely. And the Canaanites were not innocent. William Albright remarks that there were skulls all over the place, and blood drinking and child sacrifice was one of the main facets of the Canaanite faith. And William Albright, to this day that I know of, is not a believer. He's dead now, so I don't know where he is, but he was not a believer. This is a secular archaeologist, and it was to the gods of Moloch and the kind of the sister god or brother god, however you want to define it, of Enoch. And this was the blood god. And you notice that all the idolatry in the Near East never pushed for good ethics. As long as you fed your god and you kept that god happy, God would not get mad at you. And you see a complete reversal with the God of the Bible. He says, if you keep all my commandments, you will live well, and you will be a blessing to this entire world. So this cup of iniquity. And then you have God expressing in Ezekiel chapter 18. He says, I hate the death of the wicked. And then he repeats himself in Ezekiel chapter 33. He says the same thing. I take no pleasure in the death of the wicked. Let me tell you something. God says it once, it's inspired and important. When He says it twice, we better pay attention. And let me tell you what Christianity is not. Christianity is not this tough enough contest to where I get saved and then I just, by my hook and claw, just save myself into redemption. You were saved by grace. We walk by grace. And God, let me tell you something. If you're a Christian tonight, God is not angry with you. He took His anger out on Christ. Judicially, He's not angry at you. And then we have Jonah and the Ninevites. I call Jonah the prophet with the middle finger. Because pretty much since God commanded him, he gave God the middle finger. In Hebrew, of course, not in English. So, God said, please go to Nineveh because their iniquity has risen up to me. You hear that term. Either the iniquity has risen up, the cry has risen up, or the cup of the iniquity. He talks about that constantly. And he says, Jonah, you're the last straw before I bring judgment to this nation. And Jonah's like, judge them. And I'm going in the other direction. Way far away. And let me tell you something. Jonah was willing to commit suicide to see those people, rather than to see those people turn from their wickedness. People say, well, where do you get that from? When he was thrown overboard, he did not care about those sailors. And the fish actually saved his life. He would rather drown. Because how do you know he didn't care about the sailors? Because he was asleep. If you know the story, he's asleep at the bottom of the boat. So he doesn't care about these people at all. And then when they turn from their wickedness and God spares them, he wants to die. And then the book ends. And then we don't know what to do. But that's the extent. God is willing to take one of his own prophets out of his own country to spare pretty much the known capital of the modern world. Nineveh was the capital of the Assyrian Empire. And let's not be too hard on Jonah. These people were mean to the Israelites. They were killing them. They invented the chain gang, and the chain gang is how they moved Israel into the captivity when they did. And they did not hook them by their wrists. They hooked them by their mouth. These people were cruel. They would kill people and then leave their bodies on display. That's Nineveh. But that's the love of God. And see, we must look at God's judgment as a conglomerate. We can't look at specific texts, isolate them, and then make a judgment on God. God says, if their cup of iniquity is full, I have no choice in the matter. I want them to spare. And how does he prove that? 10 righteous people, and he's willing to send one of his own. And eventually he would send his son. And that would be the ultimate picture of, I want you to be in my kingdom. I don't want you in this state. So my question is God evil for doing that? Maybe we have to look at the framework of our scripture again. Okay. All of us deserve God's justice. And this is the next response, because we're all sinners. But that doesn't mean God is going to overcompensate. God is fair, and we don't want God to be fair. We want God to be merciful. And God's justice varies to the appropriation of the crimes committed. You don't get, Hitler and my good neighbor across the street who may never accept Christ are not going to get the same punishment. God's justice is fair. And God is not standing up in heaven waiting to unload his temper. Okay, those are usually just annoyed preachers. Okay. Here's the thing, and I'm just going to reiterate this. God is a good judge, and he'd rather redeem and be a merciful Savior than judge any of his creation. And you notice you see this in Ezekiel 28 when he says, take a lamentation for the king of Tyre. And he's not talking about the king of Tyre. He's talking about Satan. You get down to about verse 11, the king of Tyre was not in the Garden of Eden. So I want us to think about that. Is it going to hurt God to even punish Satan? Yeah, because God did not create the devil. God created Lucifer. That's one of his creation. It's going to hurt. Now, does Satan deserve what he's going to get? Yes, he does. And just remember James 2:13. Now, here's the big one. And this is the one I'm going to go, and then I'm going to move on to my response to slavery. You remove hell, there's no opportunity for true justice. Can you seriously think we're going to get true justice here on earth? Think about the little kid who gets raped, some two-year-old girl who gets corrupted by some person who just can't control themselves, and then they go and they corrupt this girl, they kill her, and this perpetrator never gets caught on earth. Oh, parents, you're going to want a hell at that point. See, we don't think. We've got to think sometimes. And I'm not saying you're not thinking about this stuff. I don't think you'd be here unless you did. But think about that. If you have kids, if you have siblings, if you've been on the wrong side of justice, where you have been accused of something you know you have not done, and you're like Joseph, you get the shaft. If there's no afterlife, there's no justice. If there's no hell, there's no hope of payment. That person dies getting away with that heinous crime. And my question to the atheists is, again, please think about what that means. Because according to atheists, especially if you're a Darwinist, survival of the fittest. There's no point of reference to bring justice to that person. I'm sorry. And that's tough. And that doesn't weaken the part that there are parts about hell and God's judgment we just don't know about. There is some parts of hell and justice of God. Because the Bible, this book, is not God's full revelation of himself. It's his full revelation of here on earth about himself. God is infinite, and the Bible definitely says that the secret things belong to the Lord, but those things which are revealed were revealed for our learning. That's Deuteronomy 29:29. So God has purposely hidden things sometimes, and that can be painful. And I'm with you there. I usually get mad at God about every 2 weeks. And that's why I jog. I kind of hang out with God, and I get mad at him, and I say, God, I don't like this. I really don't like this. You're screwing up here. And then I usually repent. But then there are just some days where the pain is just awful. And Christians, it's okay to feel that pain. But what if God is going to use that pain to bring you closer to him? What if it's those questions that he's driving you to ask that may make you grow in the greatest sense possible? That's the question I want to ask you. But the atheist has no point of reference for evil. And that's the problem. Okay, slavery. First of all, we have the problem of anachronistic viewpoints. Anachronism means that you're taking something that's modern and placing it back in history. So for example, to label Hebrew slavery, which I call indentured servantship, and if you read the scripture, that has everything to do with it. That's called an anachronism, because you're thinking that Hebrew slavery is just like what we had in America, that the abolitionists. But no, because that's Egyptian bondage. That's what that is, where they just put you into slavery and they just make you suffer, and there's nothing that you're going to do about this. So that's the first problem, is that we misdefine the terms. Slavery was voluntary, and there were laws protecting these people, and if they converted, they became your neighbor. Now the trial becomes, and this is the other thing, we don't have any court records on how the Hebrew law was carried out, do we? Except for the young man who committed blasphemy. And Moses took a week before he even rendered a verdict about that young man, before he executed him. I want you to think about that. At what point, if a slave master would abuse his slave so much that now the slave is tried as a regular citizen? Could that have happened? Absolutely. At what point do we define them as a neighbor? And we have no court records. But let me just kind of give you the answer that Jesus gives in John chapter 4, and let's move on. John chapter 4 is the account of the woman at the well. Jesus should have stoned her, because he said, the man you're living with is not your husband, and you got a record of 4 others that kind of fell into the same category. Now, Jesus is God. He should order her to be executed, because according to the Hebrew law, what is the punishment for adultery? Death. And you notice that he doesn't do it. Not even close. So maybe the law was carried out a lot differently than we think. If that's God sparing this woman, Who's to say that God did not move on his people? And I got news for you. If the law was executed the way that the Bible portrays it, because you have law and penalty, that's all we pretty much have. And that's because the law was to show that we needed grace. But think about it. If that law was executed to the full letter, there would be no Israel. Because Israel would not be here anymore. Because they'd all be dead. I mean, you look at the wilderness, man, there were some hopeless people in there. But even Moses and Aaron didn't make it to the promised land. So are there legitimate questions with this existential sphere? And existential just means everyday life experience. That's all that means. And so what I'm saying is, are those hard questions to live with? Yes, there are. Are there answers? Yes. Are they full? No. Do we have good glimpses to make rational decisions on? I think we do. I think when we see Jesus deal with the woman at the well, it's a picture of how the law was supposed to be applied. And Jesus was constantly rebuking the religious people of his day, that you are thinking that you're so good because you keep a law. If you were good, you wouldn't need a law. Hello? And that's the thing. They're bragging about something that was created so they would behave. Let's move on to how Jesus deals with evil. First, and this is called the redemptive sphere, Emmanuel. God gets in the human business. Hebrews 4 talks about a sympathetic high priest. And Jesus gets in the human experience, and I believe that Jesus lived the worst life that any human. I believe he suffered more than anyone will ever suffer, including people who reject God. Because when he cried out, my God, why have you forsaken me? I don't know, but up to that point, he never called God, God. He called him Father. And now he just called him God. So there's some serious pain. How did Jesus respond? Well, first, he did respond with power. He walked on water. And what does that mean? Let me tell you something. Peter's biggest problem was the water. And what God is saying to you, Christian, and encouraging you people who don't know God, if you know God, it doesn't mean that you're not going to have problems. God did not just keep Jesus in a bubble. He actually led him to a wilderness to be tempted. So what God is saying is, I will be with you. Emmanuel, God with us. That's why God became a man. Because there are answers that will be sealed. We won't know. But if we can look at God's character, we can survive. And then, not only can we survive, if Jesus walks on water, we can conquer. Even before the storm is over. He walked on the water. He literally walked on the worst problem ever. And the last time I checked, the next time Jesus would figuratively walk on water, he walked on death, sin, and the grave. And you Christians, you need to hear that. We need to hear that. Because God is saying, I want to walk on your problem too. I don't want to see you like this. To the people who are on the outside looking in, he said, I got a life for you. And no, is it going to be absent of difficulty? No, not in a million years. Because I didn't do that to my son. But I will be with you. And sometimes it's going to be painful. But Jesus was a man of sorrow, so his power. The second thing was his tears and how he wept over Lazarus. Jesus wept. Let me tell you who I can't stand. The 24-hour praise machines. Oh, everything's going to work together for good. Everything's going to work together for good. I'm so happy. And my wife and husband just left me. I'm just the happiest person in the world. My kid's in the hospital, but I'm counting it all joy. And I'm up to 100. They're so fake. And it's like the people who are looking at Christianity, that's what it's like. I don't want any part of it. Hello? Jesus wept. We can weep too. He wept then in the Garden of Gethsemane too. His tears. And what was that weep? It was an agonizing weep. It was an agonizing weep. He wept over death itself. because he hates it. 2 Timothy 1:10 says that Jesus came to abolish death and bring immortality to light through the Timothy 1:10, a great verse to remember. He came to eradicate death. He did not die on the cross to make you miserable. Although I do have a substantial amount of hair growth that makes me itch. A lot of it. You don't see it now, but I'm hiding. You wait till Friday. You're lucky I'm not speaking on Friday. That's scary. Anyway, that was my attempt at humor. I'm going to stop. The next one is his cry at the cross. He said, my God, why have you forsaken me? And I'm going to take Os Guinness's quote from Corrie ten Boom and C.S. Lewis on this. And I want to speak to anyone who's hurting in here, because I am not going to offer you me. I'm not thinking that any of these principles are here to solve your problems. I wanted to say through this talk tonight that I'm with you. I'm with you. And if God calls me, I will try to do my best so that this, hopefully you will get some principles where you can walk through your problems with other people who want to be the version as best as we can. We want to be Emmanuel too, because once Emmanuel left and he ascended on high, he brought you the church. And that was how God was still going to be with us. Right? Because he indwells the temples, right? We don't go to temple. The temples go together in a church. It's fantastic. It's fantastic. And I'm not here to get any cheers. I want Christians to be equipped, and I want skeptics to think because we care. And I don't know what you're going through. And evil and suffering are very personal. But that's why Jesus became a man. And when he cried out, my God, why have you forsaken me? This is what Os Guinness pretty much put together. And I can't say it any better. He said, God the Father allowed Jesus to be abandoned so that in our deepest suffering, we would only embrace his apparent silence. That's powerful. In our worst suffering, Jesus took the true absence of God so we would only take his apparent silence. Jesus allowed himself, the Trinity agreed that God would be abandoned so that we would never be abandoned. Is this God sounding evil to you? Is this a God who looks like he's just some great ethnic cleanser, Richard Dawkins? Or do we need to rethink this thing? And last, his victory, he rose from the dead. And in that, he rose above every circumstance that life has to offer. And I don't know what you're going through, but he does. And I got news for you. The Bible says he was tempted at all points, yet without sin. What does that mean? Did he vault 2,000 years and get into a car accident to see how he's like? Did he stop his ears so he wouldn't hear for a while? Did he just get paralyzed for a while so he could feel the pain? No. And let me tell you something. If you're going through something, I want you to know that I would, if I could, I would undo your pain. I don't want to see you go through any pain. I don't know why Jesus allows pain. But I know in his resurrection he overcame it. And is it the most pristine life? But God, no, but God doesn't owe us anything. We rebelled against him and we endure the consequences for that. And sometimes that's a tough truth to accept. Okay. So we have the philosophical sphere. I've been through that. Evil without God means evil is personal, just a personal preference. And how can we complain about evil when we're evil ourselves? That's pretty much the summary of that one. Number two, the existential sphere, dealing with hell. That if you remove hell, you remove justice. Joshua and the Canaanites, same thing. The cup of the iniquity. Remember that. And then lastly, with slavery, redefine your terms. Because slavery really is just indentured servantship. And if the foreigner converted, then they would pretty much be treated as an neighbor. Look at your scriptures. You can even look at Leviticus 25, where the greatest amount of the law was shown. Look it up. And also you have the idea in Deuteronomy 20 that if the nation was willing to allow Israel to pass through, Nothing would go under them. They would be forced laborers because God knew the pagan practices of these people. These people were not innocent. Now we have the redemptive spirit. Jesus confronted and conquered evil. And having Christ in our life, we can do the same thing. We can look at his tears. We can look at his power. We can look at his victory at the cross. And we can look at his cries and say, I may not have all the answers, but Jesus is in my problem. And he wants you to be delivered from it. And trust me, I have people, I know a kid right now, he has two brothers in a wheelchair, they both have MD, he walks, he's an athlete, and I can't imagine the guilt that that young man has, even though it's unwarranted. And if you have a disability tonight, my heart breaks for you. And even Paul, before he goes into the most difficult dialogue in Scripture in Romans 9, he said, I would rather be cursed for my countrymen and my brethren. That means he'd rather take the punishment for their sin and endure God's justice in hell so that the Jews might come to know him. Romans 9:3. And imagine if that's Paul. Remember Matthew 7:11, where he says, if you are evil and you know how to give good gifts to your children, imagine what the Father in heaven, who is perfect, will give those who follow and love him. Imagine the amplification of that. Okay. Some points of remembrance. I'm done. Number one, there's a difference between mystery and contradiction. Many times we're in the first, the former, and they're painful. And the church, we need to get alongside people, both people who are not Christians and people who are Christians, and let's make a precedent. If God has called me to help this person or to help this person endure, let's do it. Because Jesus, when the answers were sealed, God became a man. And he was tempted at all points. What does that mean? I'm going to answer that right now. He took 100% of the devil and won. That's what that meant. So that you will never have to do that. Number two, never judge a belief system by its abuse. Have Christians abused these laws? Absolutely. But atheists have done the same thing when they call God evil and they have no point of reference to define evil. They say, well, what about the Crusades? They're right. Okay? The skeptic has every right to bring that up. But are you willing to admit Stalin, Pol Pot, possibly Hitler, Mao? Look at how much evil was done in the name of no religion. And the thing of it is we have a point of reference to say what those crusaders did was wrong. What in atheism says what Pol Pot did was wrong. Nothing. Short end of the stick. Survival of the fittest. I want us to think about that. And I'm not here, again, if you're a skeptic in here, I am not here to press upon you. I just want you to think. Number three, God sacrificed the best he had so that we could live and reveal his true motive of love. God sent not his Son in this world to condemn the world, but through him that the world might be saved. Response number four, or just remembrance number four, be inspired and motivated by Christ's example to obey Christ so that we can see sin and death be eradicated in our lives. I want you to remember that. Here's the next one. Be honest with God and be real with him. Blessed are the pure in heart. If you're hurt, don't try to cover it up with a bunch of religious baggage. Just tell him. He can take hits. I know. I've given him some. But I'm not the first person. And you look at David in Psalm 88, he said, why have you rejected my soul forever? This was a man after God's own heart. Gideon said, if you love me, why have you abandoned me to lead me to the Midianites? Those are some hard questions. The more ironic thing is the fact that the Holy Spirit inspired it. If God is this mean, tyrannical dictator, why didn't he just strike Gideon down with lightning and judge him? And here's the cool thing, Jesus never rebuked Thomas. Wow. Where did he rebuke Thomas? Because Thomas was honest. That's where Thomas was at. He just said, blessed are those who won't see and still believe. That's it. He didn't say, Thomas, you're an idiot. Go back to your folder and look at what the word faith means. Did he do it to John the Baptist? Did he rebuke him? He questioned whether Jesus was God in Matthew 11. Are you the one that should come, or should we go look for another? So be honest with God. He can take the hits. And maybe he is allowing the pain in our lives, or allowing this, or even governing. The Holy Spirit's the one that led Jesus to the wilderness. And maybe he's doing that, not because he's evil and mean, but he's trying to make us better. And not only better in the sense of some self-centered better, but when we're better in God's eyes, we're better to everybody else. We're too self-motivated sometimes. No matter the circumstance, Christ is relentlessly pursuing sinners to salvation, and Christians to receive the most abundant life possible. Whether you know it or not, you don't know what God is doing behind the scenes. And then I'm going to finish with this one. Loving and obeying God allows me to love all else legitimately and positions me to be the greatest possible blessing to others, thus allotting the opportunity for the destruction of all that's evil. I don't care what you're going through, Christ is relentlessly pursuing you right now to redeem and liberate you. Because freedom is not what we can do whatever we want and just not get away with it. Freedom is being who God designed you to be, and for you to flourish fully in that design. Take a fish out of water. Is that fish free? Fish is going to die. So back to my story. Who is this guy? Who is this man that we're talking about here? Well, he celebrated his holiday 3 days ago. His name was Patrick. Patrick was not an Irishman, he was an Englishman. And he'd never gotten drunk till maybe when he was a pagan. He had a dream. He was kidnapped by pirates and druids. He went to Ireland, and he was a slave. He was born in a very aristocratic religious family. He found God, and then he escaped back to England where he had a vision from God that he was to go back. And let me tell you what the druids were like. They were like the time of Artaxerxes in the book of Esther. If you didn't have permission to go in front of the head druid, they were all cannibals too, by the way, then you died, and usually you got eaten. This man would Christianize Ireland. One man said, I'm going to take the example of Christ. He is going to redeem me. One man did that. And I challenge you that you can be that person. Each and every one. I'm not here to give you some inspirational speech. I am here, by God's grace, to give you the message and some principles that will equip you to go out and be blessings to other people. To set other people free. We've had enough of religion. I'm sick and tired of the preacher saying, get saved and live by religion. That's what we do. Get saved, but if you don't read X amount of chapters in the Bible, you're not holy. I'm sick of it. No. Get saved by grace and walk by grace, and reading the Scripture will be a pleasure to you. And what did St. Patrick do? Well, finally, in the 800s, when Ireland was invaded, they finally got invaded by, I don't remember who it is, but it's not important. A few of the Irish people, they were writing manuscripts, and there's this one famous manuscript called the Book of Kells. Go online and check it out. It is one of the most beautifully artistic made manuscripts ever.
Can you spell the
Book of Kells, it's Kells. And these Irish men and women went to an island called the island of Iona, where they would have nothing more to do than to pen and copy the scriptures that they had. But if Patrick wouldn't have gotten in front of that head, by the way, that head druid got saved. And almost all of Ireland converted. Because of an Englishman. Darn it. So much for that. It's one of the most amazing stories of one man who said, I'm going to take God at His word, and God is going to use me to face evil. I don't know every answer about evil. I know that you dismiss God, evil becomes a matter of personal preference. There are legitimate difficulties in the existential sphere, but we do have some glimpses that can make rational sense of them. But not everything, and it's not going to take away all your pain. But that's why Jesus entered the human existence in the redemptive sphere. I just gave you some words of encouragement in the remembrance sphere. And I give you Christ as the ultimate example. And I ask you that all you have to do tonight is turn from your sin, acknowledge what Christ did on the cross, and that alone, and believe by faith that He rose from the dead, and be willing to do what He asks you to do. You're not going to be perfect, but your attitude changes. That's that word that you hear all the time about repent. And you call on God. And that's what being saved, born again, having God in your heart, having a relationship with God is all about. And that's what I offer you tonight. If you're not sure, make sure. Get on your knees tonight. And remember that Christ died for you. Not so you could be condemned, but that you could be saved. And He will help you through the mysteries of life. Thank you. If you have any questions, Christians and skeptics alike, I know you're going to have a question. I'm excited. That's okay. Just please, just try to speak as clearly as possible, and I will do my best. I see Lenny's in the back. If you have science questions, you can ask him that, because I don't know anything about science. That's why I'm a philosopher. So let me just get a thing of water. I'm just going to sit in this chair real quick, and go ahead.
You were talking about slavery versus indentured servitude.
Yep.
And then you, at one point, I believe you said that slavery is voluntary, that indentured servitude is voluntary.
Yeah.
So have you read Exodus 22?
Yes, I have. What passage?
About the rules about beating slaves?
Yeah.
So unless they were masochists, that's involuntary.
Give me the reference. I'll just read it for everyone.
I actually don't know the verse, I just know the chapter.
Okay.
So you have to find it yourself, but
okay.
Or anyone can look it up themselves.
Well, first of all, the slavery was, first of all, voluntary, and unjust beatings incur punishment as well. That's the part that they don't tell you.
In Exodus 22, it says you can beat them after 1 or 2 days.
You can beat them after 1 or 2 days.
Or you beat them and you're not punished if they live after 1 or 2 days.
Right, but that is not, but the problem is the perspective of the question is the fact that this is not just something, okay, I'm just going to feel like beating my slave today. That's not what they were doing.
I'm saying it's contradictory to saying.
How is it contradictory?
To your statement.
That's the way slaves.
If I can say what I'm saying. It's internally contradictory to what you said as being indentured servitude by their own will.
No. If you read the scriptures carefully, especially Leviticus 25, you see that if they could not support themselves, they would put themselves up for slavery. We're talking about two different things. You're talking about how the rules for slavery were enforced. I'm talking about how they became slaves in the first place. And there were different principles, by the way, of foreigners being slaves. Now, here's the thing. Foreigners who were non-Jews had a completely different set of rules in terms, because why? Because their practices were not allowed. This is a covenant nation. This is a completely different type of environment. So what God wanted this nation so separate that he did not want evil to blemish it. And in Deuteronomy chapter 20, and it's a good question, it's legitimate. I'm not delegitimizing it. But what I'm saying is that also if the nation was in a sense willing to make peace, but not to necessarily convert to that system of thought or that belief system of Judaism, they would become tributary citizens. And so there was like, but God said, but then the hardest part was afterwards, and this is where a lot of the skeptics come in, is they say, well, okay, but if they don't concede to you, then you destroy and obliterate them. And I think that's where a lot of that question comes. The problem is first of all, too, that we have to remember these nations were not innocent, and I gave an example of that with the Canaanites. I mean, these people were not just sitting idly by and saying, oh, you know, we're just pristine, perfect people, and they hated Israel. Go on.
My issue was just, I wanted to clarify, are you saying that beating people after 1 or 2 days, etc., that's moral, or is that not moral?
It depends on the crime. I tell you this, all I know is that I know that a lot of people in the 21st century, we don't understand the basis, but it wasn't that it was just arbitrary or whimsical. It wasn't just like, okay, today I'm just going to beat my slave.
If they didn't work hard enough or meet somebody.
If they didn't meet a standard, and it was a legitimate standard, but if you read also in Exodus, I believe in the latter chapters, I think it's 25, I'm not sure on that, it gets close to the blueprint of the tabernacle. But also in Leviticus, if the master overcompensated, for example, and I'm not going to sit here and say that, by the way, that the Jews did not abuse these laws. I mean, God rebuked them that all the time. But Christ would have never abolished slavery. You got to remember that Christ said he fulfilled, like we talked about this just before I spoke, he fulfilled the law and the prophets. But at the same time, the law was just. But when you put sinful people into a perfect law, they're going to abuse it. And the problem is the wickedness of the heart. But that, we're just saying because possibly we don't see what happened to the slave master that they got away with it, and that's not necessarily the case. Okay, so I think we have to just kind of think about that. It's a tough issue, it really is, and trust me, I look at that text and with trepidation as well sometimes, and I bought books on it. And if you want a good one, I have one. Is God a Moral Monster? This is by Paul Copan. Good book to read. He really helps. Does it answer everything? No, but we have to remember that we're bringing a 21st century framework into a covenant nation, and a covenant nation that had a lot of miraculous revelation to it.
It seems to make God a moral relativist, though.
No, God's not a moral relativist. He's a progressive revealer.
And I would say that's just merely euphemism.
I disagree with you, and we'll have to disagree.
What's the difference in meaning there?
Progressive revelation is just like the fact that, first of all, I mean, God did not reveal the full Trinity until Jesus came. Was he always triune? Yes, he was. So I don't consider that relative. God never changed his mind.
I mean, again, Jews would disagree with you, but
some,
depends on
some, not all.
Well,
I mean, you can look at the dual. If you look at the dual in the Hebrew, if you look at the dual in the Hebrew in Genesis chapter 1, where he says, "Let us make man in our image," it's a singular being, but a plurality of persons. And also our God, the greatest commandment in Deuteronomy 6:4 is one Lord, our God. That's Elohim, that's plural. And there's a duality of persons, but everything that we know, and including in science, that it's progressive. We learned, we didn't get to quantum physics just because we abolished Newton. We enhanced, we built upon Newton and Einstein, and then we moved on to some of the other people. Okay, we got some other questions. Can you just state your name too, by the way? What's your name?
What?
Your name?
Oh, Mike.
Mike, I don't want to say hey or whatever, that's kind of not nice. Yes, your name, and then just ask your question.
My name is Sam.
Hi, Sam.
You kept saying that atheists don't have a reference point. I was just curious, what about the idea behind a universality kind of golden rule, where you do unto others not what you want to be done to yourself, but what everyone wants to do, what everyone would want. So, and to me that kind of fits as an ideal kind of idea, because it also allows social interactions and social groups to work together, as opposed to that anarchy kind of idea that I'll do, you know, whereas Doris kind of talked about the idea of the survival of the fittest. this allows kind of a group to work together, because just as you would want others to, just as you would want others to help yourself, you would help others.
Absolutely. No, it's a good question. And let me clarify something too, Sam, that I'm not saying also that atheists can't be moral either. Okay? I didn't make the statement. Atheists can be very moral. They put Christians to shame many, many times. I'll admit that up front. The way some atheists I've seen run their families, and the way I see some, I mean, you look at the Christian divorce rate, and you can kind of, it's unfortunate, but let me answer you. What I was making the case for was that atheists really have no substantiation or basis to call anything evil, to define evil. Now, they can adopt the golden rule arbitrarily, and they can live by it, but they have no reason to, and because there's really no overall purpose. And that's what I'm saying, is that what's their standard? And if they say themselves, if I'm my own standard, well, then you have 7 billion standards. And then you get a lot of chaos. Go ahead.
Well, obviously, that's why the golden rule itself is flawed, is because it's too much of a self kind of thing. Where I was talking about like a universal kind of thing, whereas everybody believed in
But
this.
who decides that?
Well, obviously, that's why it would be a universal thing. And whereas you said, where they don't have an idea for evil, evil will obviously be the opposite of it. So, assumingly that the universe would assume that raping a 2-year-old is not morally okay.
But you can say that, Sam, but the problem becomes is that when that, if people, and children are really good at this, that's why they ask why all the time. And why should I do this? Why should I pick up my room? And things like that. Now, it seems petty, but I'm not being petty. And what I'm saying, Sam, is that eventually you're going to have to ground that principle. And that's where I can't see it. You're going to have to ground it and see that, and this is the big thing, is we need to get into the idea that ethics are always for people. They're not for objects. And that I can't look at the way the wind blows and that tells me that I should obey my mother. You see what I'm saying? I mean, you don't, and I'm not trying to be funny. I'm just saying that you cannot get personal ethics from an impersonal force. You see what I'm saying? Ethics is always personal. That's why Jesus is a person. That's why God is a personal being. Because we define all our right and wrong based on a person. And the cool thing about Christianity is here's how you judge a system. You judge it by the sacred book and the life of the founder. Now notice if you look at the life of the founders of some other religions, these guys, the telltale sign of a cult is a person, a one-person dictator, giving their rules and then not living it by themselves. You see that, like for example, in Islam, Muslims are only allowed to have 4 wives and Muhammad had 11. Okay, and so I just don't, to answer it, I cannot see the grounding of that ethic. It's a good idea. I don't deny that it's a good idea, but where does that come from? And that's the hardest question to ask. And they've tried with science, they've tried with genetics, they've tried it with just saying, well, moral relativism, what's true for you is true for you, and it just breaks down when it gets into the harder difficulties of life. When I talk about the young girl who gets raped by some guy and for his own personal disgusting pleasure, and the problem is if a true Nietzschean actually had this question posed to him, and he said, I don't like what that person did, but I cannot honestly call them evil.
But whereas this would kind of call it evil, obviously, because whereas everybody would see that as something wrong, it's the golden rule.
Correct, but the problem is that golden rule has no foundation, except just impersonal agreement. And that's...
It's founded on a universal kind of idea.
But good luck in trying to, unfortunately, get that to happen. And that's the thing. Like I said, Sam, I'm not discrediting what you're trying to say. I'm just saying it's going to be impossible because somebody's going to be self-centered enough to go against it, and there's going to be no consequence for them to do it. See, the idea of an ethic, and that's what Immanuel Kant's problem was, by the way. He got rid of God through the front door, as R.C. Sproul says, he let him back in the side, because if he doesn't have God, then ethics really don't mean anything because there's no justice. And he brought God back in because of justice, because you get rid of God, then really the afterlife is the only hope for true justice. I mean, if there's no afterlife, there's definitely not going to be justice here on earth. You either get lucky or you don't. And that's some of the things that we struggle with. And Sam, whatever facet you're dealing with this, it's legitimate. I'm not, you've asked a really good question. And I'm just trying to bring some suggestions that possibly could help. I saw your hand. Okay, your name?
I'm Jordan.
Jordan.
All right. I did want to start off by just saying that I really do, even though I disagree with a lot of the things that have been said, I really do respect this viewpoint, your viewpoint, just as much as any other one.
Thank you.
I really
Thank
do.
you.
And it was very eloquently presented.
Thank you.
I did have one question
Sure.
about, because you mentioned that when you were talking about a genetic foundation for morality. Now, you're very right in saying that unless there's some foundation, it becomes sort of
Floating?
yeah. In a lot of ways. But the way that I think about how it could have some form of genetic foundation,
Okay.
just to try and propose it myself,
Absolutely, go ahead.
is that when it comes down to survival of the fittest,
Mhm.
it's not necessarily about an individual at some point, because when humans are not the strongest beings on the planet. They are not the most fierce. They are not the most deadly. In all honesty, what comes from our strength is our ability to come together.
To make weapons.
It really is. But that wouldn't necessarily happen if we weren't able to we were genetically programmed to be able to form some sort of form of society.
Yep.
So that in and of itself, the fact that was a genetic strength that could have developed over the course of millions of years, however you want to look at it, is a way to have that genetic foundation without saying that it just sort of worked.
Let me respond to this because it's good. It's not. And first of all, I do believe that kind of what we would say the religion is we're getting a lot of the argument that religion is embedded in the DNA of humans and therefore God doesn't exist. And the problem is it's a complete non sequitur. It doesn't make any difference. Well, I found the God thing. Well, maybe God put it there. We don't know. Here's my answer to that question. The problem is there's nothing in nature that says there's nothing in nature that says why should I survive? Survive in the actual term itself is an ought. There's an ought in survival. That means that survival has a purpose to it. You see what I'm saying? And nature has no ought. I mean, nature stuff just happens. And the issue I have, and this is a big problem in the agnostic. I was going to debate Matt Dillahunty not too long ago. Do you know who he is? Yeah. And it got canceled, man. It's not my fault. I was ready. I was ready. Matt was all set to come here and probably kick my butt. And the Genocide students who were supposed to bring him in complained about who would pick him up from the airport. So that was their problem. That's their problem, not mine. But Matt's a guy who has come up with some ideas where he believes that if you come to a consensus within a group, that those objectives now become absolute within the group. But when you hear, and it's on YouTube, it's called The Greatest Rant Ever, he goes off on this poor lady who talks about predatory Catholic priests and that they get away with stuff, and Matt just pretty much says suck it up and deal with it because life is not fair. Okay, but that's the problem that Immanuel Kant was trying to get rid of, and the sad part is that's why Kant brought God back into the equation, was because of issues in his day that just seemed unjust. And by the way, Kant's not the first one. Habakkuk dealt with that, by the way. He said, God, your law is empty. It's futile because I don't see justice at all. And then he would come back in his prayer and say, in your wrath, remember mercy. It's a pretty amazing statement. That's Habakkuk 3:2. You want to write that one down. It's a good verse to meditate upon. But Jordan, I understand. I don't say, and I think I know what you're saying, maybe somehow morality or the conscience, I just don't see it embedded in genetics. But I'm more geared towards, and I don't think that we're going to find a physical cause for morality. I just don't see it happening. They've tried very, very hard. But at the same time, I think because I'm more towards the biological determinist who says, well, my cells just make me a drunk, or my cells make me religious. Well, the problem is you turn that argument inward on the theory itself. Well, my cells made me think I'm a biological determinist. You see what I'm saying? Because they're assuming all along that their cells did not make them come up with that theory. But they have to include themselves in the theory that their cells made them think that they're a biological determinist, and then it just contradicts itself right at the core. But as far as the evolution thing, my only question there is how can an ought, or because survival implies that there's a purpose, and I don't see that in raw nature. I just don't see it. And that's the way and like I said, I haven't studied the genetic side of morality a lot. I mean, some guys that are really good on the pro side of genetic morality, a guy by the name of Dean Hamer, if you're familiar with him, he's done a lot of studies about it. I don't agree with him, but obviously, but I still think that the biggest flaw is they think their theory is outside of their cells, but it really isn't. If biological determinism is true, then their cells made them think up that theory. And that's where the issue becomes. Okay, I saw more hands.
Sure.
Go ahead, Greg.
All right, Jeremy, I got a thought for you. It's more of a comment, and I want you to comment on my comment if that's all right.
Sure.
I learned that in Afghanistan before the war, if you had a group of second grade girls, some of the girls were already married, and they were married to men who were 20s, 30s, 40s. By the third grade, virtually all of the girls were married.
Okay.
And, of course, these are girls in third grade. These are like 9-year-old girls, and they were performing marital relations with the 40-year-old man that they were married to.
That's disgusting. Keep going.
Thank you. And I guess this one's going to have a two-part to it.
Go ahead.
I just think about the genetic determinism. As you know, my degree is in biotechnology.
Yep.
And if our morality is genetic, then that would say that that the people of Afghanistan have the genetic determinism for this type of behavior. Yeah. At the same time, if universalism, or if what's true for you is true for you and true for me is true for me, yeah. I mean, any of that stuff, moral relativism or universalism, sure. It seems like, even today, the majority of the world views women as being inferior to men. It is in the Christian West that women are considered equal. Right. So if you're going, and then we go to, if we're going to say everything is relative, then we can't say that the Afghans are wrong.
Okay, let me respond to that. First of all, the problem is let me tell you a very subtle issue what happened in the fall of man. And Nate, if my time is up, just let me know.
You got a bit.
Okay.
You got like 25 minutes.
Okay, great. So think of some questions. That's why I usually I like Q&As. The first thing is when the fall of man took place, the universe it shifted from a love-centered universe to a power-centered universe. I think that we messed that up a lot. Because you can see within Adam and Eve that they became self-conscious. They didn't sow fig leaves for one another, they sowed them for themselves. And you saw the first idea of selfishness come in. And then man said, well, okay, I'm stronger than this being, and I will blame her for all the problems that we have. And then, of course, the woman blames the animal, and then pretty much we have philosophies that reduce us down to nothing but animals. And the issue becomes, is you're right, Greg, and the issue becomes, let me tell you something, and by the way, people will get out of their relativist mode very, very quickly, by the way. Especially when it's dealing with a person's, especially Americans' money, okay? I don't see too many relative bankers. Okay, like they say I have $5,000 in the bank, and that person's truth is I only have 50. There's going to be a fight. Okay, or we have a relative surgeon who you're in for heart surgery, and they cut open your knee. You see the absurdity when you bring this into the existential realm. that ideas just sound so nonsensical. That's why we have the arts. And I think, Greg, and you see the expressions with the oppression of women. And you saw that even Jewish people, we had your mom's friend when he came to the Bible study, one of the conservative Jewish prayers is that thank God he's not a woman. Last time I checked, when God created male and female, he called it really good. Okay? And the sad part is Jesus revolutionized the treatment of women. And so did the Old Testament. I mean, the Old Testament is not anti-woman. Okay? You see this and we misinterpret this, and that's one of the greatest accusations. I didn't get into that. But the problem becomes is you look at the treatment of women, and you see Jesus treat the woman well. Who were the first two people to find Jesus or find the empty tomb? They weren't men. It was Mary Magdalene, for example. She's the one. And so if the Christians are trying to make up a myth, and by the way, in April 6th, I'll deal with this when I give the resurrection talk that I'm going to give at the University of Rochester. The women were the first people to find at the tomb. So you see a revolutionary idea, but I think, Greg, just to kind of sum it all up, you definitely see just the breakdown when you see it put into everyday life. Moral relativism, genetic determinism, all that stuff dies a very easy death. And people don't live by it. They become the quickest hypocrites I've ever seen in my life, because if I have $5,000 in the bank, you better give it all to me, or there's going to be some issues. Or, for example, obviously, if any parents in here have said, who would touch their kids of some sort, I mean, I know a few Italian men in here who would go ballistic, and trust me, I'm not negating that just because I know them very, very well, if they ever touched their kids in that sense. And that's right. But a relativist would say, well, why are you intruding on their truth? Why are you being intolerant? That's their truth. And that's the tough part. And let me tell you something. And again, I want to reiterate that just becoming a Christian doesn't solve all the problems. Okay? It hurts sometimes to be a Christian. There are difficult issues. And let me tell you one. Is when grace is extended to a person who's about to go to the electric chair, and I have a good neighbor who I would trust my life savings with, and they never accept Christ, and there's a penalty afterwards. Grace doesn't sound so great at that point. You're telling me that somebody can just go witness to this guy on death row, he gets executed 10 minutes later, and he goes to heaven, and this person who's been nice to me all my life goes to hell? There's some mysteries, people. That's tough stuff. And that's where Christianity, there are mysteries within Christianity. So there are definitely questions, and that comes from my weight room devotion, by the way. We talked about that for 6 weeks, and we tried to just get some principles out of that. But Christians, we need to voice those things, right? We need to make those things known and say, hey, I struggle with that. You want Sam?
I'm just going to put this out there. So I'm Jewish.
Okay.
And I'm quite open to most beliefs and religions.
And by the way, there are different sectors of Judaism. Just
obviously.
Okay.
I just want to correct you just because.
Go ahead, please do.
There is a prayer that says that you did not make me a woman.
Mm-hmm.
Just to correct you, the actual interpretation of it is you did not give me the hardship of woman.
Okay.
Whereas man is thanking God for not giving him the pain of labor and such.
Sure.
As opposed to not making me,
Right. I think well, let me just give you the experience that I had. That was not put that way. So it was not put that way. But no, thank you. I really appreciate that. No, and please correct me if I'm wrong on anything, especially that I know when that can get thorny when I get into slavery too. So I mean, yeah. Okay. Good. Thank you.
Can I jump in there? Just because I knew the guy too.
Yeah.
The guy he was talking about was, we've all known, it wasn't a knock on Judaism itself, because obviously without the Jewish writers, you don't have a Christianity. Jews wrote every single book in the Bible, including all of the books of the New Testament. The particular guy we were talking. Are you sure?
All of them. Oh, yeah.
I've heard the others. I've heard that Luke was a Jew, but maybe there's some debate about that. But if you just have Luke, you don't really have a Bible because it wouldn't make any sense, because it would say, well, there's God. And it's like, what's God? You haven't defined God. You need the Old Testament to define God. You need the Old Testament to say, hey, we've fallen. You know, this world was created perfect, and then it sucked, and then there was a promised Messiah to help redeem it back to God. But just this particular guy was just he was just an interesting character. So I just wanted to make sure that he wasn't knocking.
That's true. Okay. Any other questions? Yes. Your name?
I'm Kelly.
Hi, Kelly.
So, I'm kind of having a difficult time in how I want to construct this because there's multiple aspects.
That's
to
okay.
this.
Go ahead. Take your time.
Now, like, obviously, a large part of what we've been talking about here is, like, the actual genetic determination of how our, like, you know, our morals go versus, like, the social constructs that actually develop those social morals.
Correct.
Now, like, one of my favorite books in high school, honestly, was Lord of the Flies.
Okay.
Sorry.
It's okay.
One of my favorite books in high school was, like, Lord of the Flies, and honestly, it's because you read through it and you realize at the end that it's the way that they actually needed to survive, the actual way that they had developed their own society in order to be able to survive on this island by themselves as children. They actually had to create a society, however brutal it ended up turning out to be. But it's the lack of another kind of, there's nothing imposing any other kind of restraint, I guess, on their morality. Children die. Really, actually, the Christ figure in the story dies, and it's actually a really terrible story. But
yes, it is.
Now, there's like other parallels to this, though. It's not just like, because I'm going back to the mercy and justice thing.
Go ahead.
There's other parallels to this. Now, say like in nature, other species.
Yep.
Say like packs of dogs.
The wolves nurturing factor. Yep.
It's not. I'm actually not going to touch on that, but that's a good point. But I'm talking more along the lines of, say, an intruder dog, an intruder wolf. Like if it comes into the pack, it's very unwelcome. Packs of dogs are very tight-knit. They don't allow other animals to come inside of it. And usually, like, you know, you would assume that they would just kill them. But that's not always the case. There's a lot of mercy in that.
Okay.
So, I have like actually witnessed, like I'm from the mountains in California. I've seen packs of coyotes where like literally it would be like a pack. And another animal would come in, and then they would actually let it run away instead of killing them. And I consider that to be a mercy aspect. But if there's a difference between us and other species, and I don't quite understand like why grace was only given to our species as opposed to another species, where you can obviously see emotional disdain in like gorillas. If another gorilla does something wrong, they fight, they kill each other, but they also help and they heal each other, and like you can see their emotional issues with certain things.
Okay. This is a good question, by the way. I know the direction we're going, and it's keep going if you need to add anything. Go ahead. Do you want me to respond to that first? And if you let me respond to that first, and then because it's a lot, but it's good. I understand what you're saying. The first thing, the distinguishing, let me just give you biblically where I'm going to distinguish humans from animals is that the Garden of Eden is the tree of knowledge of good and evil. You didn't see a dolphin there, okay? And I'm not making light of your question at all, okay? But you didn't see any other species. We have similarities, but we are more than just our physical properties, and we have an invisible part. I don't believe animals have spirits, okay? Now here's the thing, God did create animals and still call the creation good. Okay, so to the extent that humans are over animals in a diminutive sense, yes. And are they unique from animals? Yes, they are. However, does that mean they have the right to go out and abuse these animals? No. Okay. But at the same time, hunting and things like that, I mean, you get into some very personal convictions there. But humans are not animals in the sense of the way animals are animals, because there are a lot of things, there's a lot of good aspects and examples within animals, but then there's a lot of bad ones. You see the black widow spider, after the female and the male copulate, the female kills the male. Well, that's not good. And again, if we applied that to the human sphere, that would be really bad.
And the other thing is you also see the sea turtle abandon her young at 3 days, and things like that. So it's a mixed bag, and the difficulty there is to find you can see the similarities, for example, and we can go into DNA and things like that, which I know something about, but I would not claim to be an expert by any way. But the difference to me is that here's the main difference, and I like the way that John Lennox's mentor put it. And he said that when man was created in God's image, no animal was created in God's image, and he would say, well, prove it. Well, it's easy, because man was the only creature God could become. Because Jesus became man, and he's God. And that's what it really means to be created in God's image, is that the Messiah, the Christ, the Savior of the world, was a human being and not any other thing. It does not diminish the fact, because we still have to remember that God created the animals before humans. Okay, now that I don't believe there's any precedent there, but he called it all good. You see what I'm saying? So I think, Kelly, you have some points, and I think we can see examples that we can live. As a matter of fact, Proverbs makes that example. You know, if you're lazy, look at the ant, or if you're this, look at this example. And you can find wisdom within the animal kingdom. And sometimes animals are a lot smarter than we are, but that's what happens when we fell, is that we reduced ourselves, and even the animal kingdom puts us to shame. And that's not to put anything bad on them. I don't disrespect. Like, for example, someone loses their pet, okay? Will they be in heaven? I don't know. All I know is I'm glad that that pet's not in heaven or hell. Because at that point they're out of their misery, but does that mean God can't recreate that creature? No. God could simply just... Who says that we're not going to have animals in heaven? If they were good enough for the pre-fallen world that we have before man fell, why aren't they good during the afterlife? You know what I mean? I think that a lot of people we assume that because people have bad interpretations. I think we're not sensitive enough to people but we do have a dominion over animals, and we see that. We get food and things like that, and of course, I do believe that we were all vegetarians before that, but I'm not going to make a case for vegetarianism because I'm not one. But at the same time, because there are scriptural principles that go against that. But I don't, but Kelly, you brought up a good point. I don't think that your question is bad. Does that give you a little bit of insight? Does that, you may not agree with me, but does that...
I can see why that's where you thought I was going to go, but that's actually not where I was going to go.
Darn! Go ahead. Just let me shut up. Go ahead.
To be more succinct about it is, I was actually kind of bouncing off Sam's idea of the universal golden rule. That if there can be such grace and such good in other species, then why can't it be believed that there's, especially other species with...
But that's humans looking at animals and calling them good.
But
would a lion consider a lion good?
I'm specifically speaking about species, especially the ones with like the really well-developed frontal lobes, where it really defines what moral intelligence might mean. But how is it that we necessarily can't, why can't we say that there is a distinguished universal golden rule? And especially when there's obviously, there's an understanding of right and wrong, even in species that don't have communication as well developed as ours.
Because there's no point of reference, but the animal kingdom is chaotic, because the absolute antithesis is there as well, as the opposite is there. You see lions brutally killing other animals and thinking, but let me finish. But then not thinking twice about it at all. And last time I checked, I haven't seen any of them feel guilty about it. They usually eat their prey. If that were to happen in the human kingdom, they'd get arrested. And they would be labeled Jeffrey Dahmer Part 2. And so we do have some distinguishing factors, but this is where the fundamental difference becomes. I don't believe humans are just mere bags of cells that have evolved over years. Obviously, I think that there's a big invisible part to us, that we have souls, and I'm not saying that you may not. But the problem becomes, and you talked about the frontal lobe, I did a whole talk on human consciousness up in Geneseo where we evolutionists, and I had a neurosurgeon say that he admitted he was a disturbed dualist. And what that meant was that he could not find within the human brain where human consciousness comes from. Now that leads to a problem when you're trying to bring evolutionary ethics into the picture, because if I'm not cognizant of what I'm doing, or I have no physical concept, how can I be accountable to it? And that's where that comes into play. And like I said, we see good examples in the animal kingdom, but I don't think the animal kingdom is the precedent that we should be following. I don't see it at all. Yeah.
Just to tie into that, I just want to talk from a scientific point of view about evolution and creation, but never get a chance to ask questions that don't necessarily have to do with science. And one is the ultimate great example of, are we just animals? I almost feel like Hitler pretty much followed a social aspect of Darwinism in the sense that he had an attitude of survival of the fittest, and he deemed Jews inferior and blacks inferior, and anybody that wasn't Aryan inferior. And once he decided that was true for a nation and sold that bill of goods and made everybody in the town feel that they were superior, because they had blue eyes or something. If they are just animals, then we should owe them an apology, because they really followed some of the tenets of survival of the fittest pretty well. The survival of their group over another group and proved superiority because they kind of got away with it. So I was wondering what your thoughts would be on that.
Yeah, let me respond to that, because I mean, really, a lot of times the animal kingdom is kind of a might mix right type of atmosphere. Is that what you're trying to pretty much? I mean, Hitler had the means to do it.
I'm saying that fittest is a psychology sometimes. It's
okay.
You're fit if you get away with being stronger than the person next to you, and he almost got away with it.
Right.
I guess at the Nuremberg trials, didn't they make a point pretty much?
Yes, they did. And here was the issue.
Our truth is our truth. And
right. And that, remember in the Nuremberg trials when the Nazis went on trial, remember they had to appeal to natural law and even to convict these people, because the German lawyer put them in a very, very tough spot. They pretty much, now is Darwinism the only influence here? Let me throw a disclaimer in, because I know where Lenny's going with this. First of all, he's not thinking that Darwinism was 100% responsible for the Nazi concentration camps, okay? Did it influence Hitler? Oh yeah. Oh yeah. And people say, well, evolution wasn't in Germany. Well, check out Hegel, last time I checked, was German. So no, it was there. And the influence was there. And if you read Mein Kampf in German, survival and fittest are all over that work. The problem in the Nuremberg trials is the prosecuting or the defending lawyer for the German Nazis pretty much stood up and says to the American lawyer, "Sir, do you teach in your colleges and new universities that morality is relative, that pretty much is your truth is your truth?" And the lawyer said yes, because the German lawyer had evidence of it, so he was in a fix. He said, well, then why are you impeding on our precedent? We think that Jews in our culture are like this, or blacks. And by the way, the second largest people group to be killed in the Nazi concentration camps were Christians. 1.2 million of them. And so to say that Hitler was Catholic and all this other stuff, that Christopher Hitchens has to really stretch in order to make his case. But the problem is then why are you impeding as an American lawyer? Why are you prosecuting them when that's their truth? And again, you have the problem with moral relativism right there. Because there's nothing in the animal kingdom that I believe, and Sam and Kelly, you brought up some really good points, that establishes that golden rule with any type of solid foundation. I'm not saying it's a bad way to live by. And I'm not discrediting that and I'm not, by no means am I demeaning you and saying that you haven't thought this stuff out. You've clearly thought it out, and you've thought it out very, very well. but I just don't see at the end of the day, ethics are meant to be enforced. And the problem is laws are here because humans are not good, because they're bad. And that's the whole big thing with the Sermon on the Mount. Jesus takes the commandments of the Old Testament and escalates them to higher stuff. If you hate somebody, you're guilty of murder. And what does he mean by that? Well, what he means is the only reason why you're not committing murder against certain individuals is because the law is kind of just an annoying consequence. And then the Pharisees go and brag that they're keeping this law and Jesus is saying, look, if you're truly good-natured, you wouldn't need a law in the first place. And so the issue becomes, if God is removed from the picture, I don't see a foundation. Now, we could get into a whole different argument on which God, okay? And the one thing that skeptics that I don't, if I were a skeptic and I was saying, if I was going to criticize the God of the Bible, I would say that he was evil and he exists. And all you have to do is look at human beings and you can figure it out if we're created in his image. Okay, now I don't agree with that, but I think that's a harder case to kind of refute than to negate God's existence, and then you have no point of reference for evil. Well, maybe we're just reflecting our evil creator. That's a hard one to fuss with when you really think about it. And I've yet to see where the negation of God has brought the goodness of man. That's the problem that we see. We see the 20th century brought this to light, and I'm not saying that atheism drove these individuals. Now, there were some. I mean, Pol Pot, clearly, his atheism drove him to kill those people. Mao, same thing. Because there was no point of accountability for these people. So without God, I just don't see any point of reference for planet. We have to conclude there?
Yeah, we should.
Okay. Well, thank you, everyone, and I hope... Just really quickly, on the back table, we have some other stuff and some other events that we're going to be participating next Tuesday. That guy's going to be talking about stuff called Where Does the Evidence Lead? Right at SUNY Geneseo, all the information's on the back table. We'd love to have you come. Thank you.